Okay, everyone, welcome to the Hour of Power. The topic today is going to be spiritual awakenings, and I put a plural on there. It's interesting. We did some readings in the last few times, and they're really amazing in the stories because it says in here in the forward that the stories are ways to show how people talk about the situation, but how at the end of usually each story it talks about how they attain their higher power, their spiritual awakening through a higher power. So I took some that I had underlined through the years I've been reading this book that, and I'm going through them. They're very, very powerful. And I use the word spiritual awakening because by reading these, and it's just if we listen to what they have to say, each one is like a paragraph or two paragraphs, and it's just amazing how we have that transformation. And I also had another word here, grace. And it's interesting. I looked up the definition. They have the in the Webster dictionary, the spiritual definition. Here it goes. It's pretty amazing. Here's a definition of grace: the love and mercy given to us by God because God desires us to have it, not necessarily because of anything we have done to earn it. We are, and also I put here the stuff we are creating God's image. So all these defects of character, the guilt, the shame, the remorse, and all of those were due to that I felt I wasn't worthy of life and that things I had done were bad. But here it's telling me the grace of God is that transformation when all of a sudden and in all the stories I'm going to be reading now, it talks about exactly that. And that's what's going to be so amazing as we unravel these. And if you take them in, you realize just the light goes on. And it just talks about that grace of a higher power, a higher consciousness, whatever you want to call it, spirit of the universe. And again, we always say that so long as it's not me, as long as it's not Bob, I'm fine. Because I do feel, and we are, as it says in the big book, created in the image of God. God created us, right? He made us physically perfect. He made us, and he also did spiritually. So either we want to go to the dark side and go into our ego, sometimes they refer to it as the devil, right? Our mind is like a battlefield, right, between the good and the evil. So we want to be on the good side, and that's where all the power and grace and glory is, right? The all glory and beauty is with the power of God. So it says here that we don't have to ponder anymore. We don't have to be depressed, anxious about all of these things in our lives, the guilt, the shame, the remorse, right? Sentimentality is another one, old lost loves, or, so we can be renewed in thinking and spirit and with the higher consciousness, which is all love, peace, and patience, right? It says it 100 times in this book, it'll talk about that. But let me get right to the first one. So if you don't have a big book, that's fine. You could just listen. So on page 468, and it's in a chapter called Listening to the Wind. And it's an American Indian on page 468, the middle of actually the first paragraph. If you look there, it says, I was finally able to complete an honest inventory. And we talked about that last time. An honest inventory is, again, knowing the truth, which the truth from the false. The truth will set us free. So when I did my inventory, I thought it was all about telling somebody the truth, not lying to them. No, it was about me all the time, lying to myself, lying to myself, telling me that I was all important and everything was about me. It was about the ego and about the self. So anyway, it goes on to say, the fifth step, this is really interesting. So here we're going right through the steps, enabled me to see my part in resentments and fears. Okay. So when it uses the word resentments and fears, in this 65 in the columns, it talks about a bracketed fear. It's all related to self, and the word self-centered fear. And the main thing, when you think of all our problems in life, they're related to our relationships, to people, places, and things, right? And it says here, resentments. So we had these resentments, expectations, and it says here in the chapter how it works in the big book, I was shown some questions. The answer to these questions provided me with knowledge about my reactions to the conditions in my life. Notice again the word my reactions. It doesn't say here the things that happened to me in life, right? Why doesn't it say that? Why doesn't it say look at all the things that happened? It's using the word my reaction. So here's the beginning. this American Indian who wrote this chapter, Listening to the Wind, of the spiritual awakening. The whole beginning part of all of these stories goes into what happened to them and all these crazy things. They hit bottom and they became to realize that power great in themselves could restore them to sanity. So here's the spiritual awakening here. Every response to every resentment, real or imagined, right? When I think it could be, when a person does something to me, sometimes it's real, which, it's real in the sense that it may be real, but most of the time it's in my imagination, right? Our mind imagines these things. Had been sick and self-destructive, right? So it's saying that these emotions, fear, anger, resentment, I used to try to analyze and figure them out. Why am I depressed? Why am I anxious? But it's saying here that they're sick and self-destructive. So if you have something, if you're holding a hot coal in your hand, would you hold on to it? No, because it's destructive. So it's telling me here they are sick and self-destructive. These emotions, these feelings. Meanwhile, prior on self-will and trying to self-help books try to get into why I was angry, why I shouldn't be angry, why I should have, could have, would have, and all of these things. Why am I depressed? But here it's saying these are very destructive. Why would I want to hold on to them, right? I was allowing others to control my sense of well-being and behavior. Wow. We go through our lives being slaves, right? We're slaves to everybody else, wondering what they're thinking or saying about us or what they're doing. And we become a slave, like, in a cell, like in a prison, of the self-centered fear. If I got rid of self-centered fear, I would be happy, joyous, and free. I wouldn't worry if somebody looked at me the wrong way, if they told somebody something about me, if they gossip about me, or if they said something to me directly. That has to do with the self, the ego. That's. So anyway, it says, I came to understand that the behavior, opinions, and thoughts of others were none of my business, right? You ever hear that? What other people think and say is none of my business? Again, to me, I ran my whole life the opposite of this. It was my business what you thought about me. It was my business to set you straight, to make you understand that you had to understand who I thought I was, right? So he's saying that he come into this spiritual awakening here, that the thoughts of others was none of his business. The only business I was to be concerned with was my own, right? I asked my higher power to remove from everything that stood in the way of my usefulness to him. This is so powerful because it's saying here, not that we do it on self-will. We don't do it. And the steps when we go to 5, 6, and 7, I always tried to do it. I tried not to be angry. I tried to figure it out. I tried not to be depressed or anxious. But it's saying that, and as soon as we put it on somebody else, God is our partner, right? If I have a business and God is my partner, if I have a partner in a business and there's a difficult situation or customer, some kind of thing coming up, and I know my partner says, don't worry, I'll take care of it. And I knew they're very competent, they would, I could just sit back and relax. But we have this unmerited favor. It talks about in this grace here. It says, going back to the topic of grace and spiritual awakening, we were given this favor because we were created in God's image. So we no longer have to be upset or worry about anything because it's not about us anymore. It's about God and a higher consciousness, again, inside of us all the time. And it says, and help me to build a new life. And on page 469, near the middle of the first paragraph there, near the end, it says, I stand at the top of the sacred mountain. So here's an American Indian who had the spirit, spiritual. And when you read, it's really interesting of the belief system, the Holy Great Spirit, right? So, and I listen to the wind. The wind and all these elements in the sun and all of these come from God and the spirit of the universe. I have a conscious daily contact with my creator today. So daily, it's, the steps are amazing. The steps are an instruction book to come to this. And he talks about here in the 12th step at the beginning of this paragraph. So here are people, we all come in, a lot of us, with these different religious beliefs. He had certain, we all have different Eastern or Western religions, but the steps give us a step-by-step way. And he talks about step 12 on page 469 at the top of that paragraph. He says the word prayer and the 12th step and it called an investment in my spiritual freedom and fulfillment. So obviously through the steps, he got back to his inner resource, his higher power, which to him was the spirit of the universe, and he stood on the mountaintop. He loves me. Everything is sacred as a result of the 12 steps. Can you imagine going through your life like he's doing now at spiritual awakening, thinking everything and everyone is sacred, and seeing the beauty and love in everything and everyone, and recovery in Alcoholics Anonymous. So that's page 468, 469, listening to the wind. You know, it just brings to mind, and I just reminded what Bill said. If you go to page 14 in Bill's story, let me get to that. And I just had to read this. It just reminded me of this. He said, it says here, on the top of page 14, he says, and it's a similar, I just wanted to refer to his spiritual awakening, and then we'll go back to the other story. Simple but not easy, a price had to be paid. It meant destruction of self-centeredness. And what does he say all throughout this, the end of the story we read, about not worrying about what other people say or think, and he became free of him. I must turn all things to the Father of light, who presides over us all. These were revolutionary and drastic proposals, this on page 14, but the moment I fully accepted them, the effect was electric. Okay. The reason I wanted to read this is because if we go on, this was a sense of victory, followed by a peace and serenity I had never known. This was utter confidence. And on the next sentence, it just thought about it because it's relating to that story with the American Native Indian, right? I felt lifted up as though the great clean wind of a mountaintop blew through and through. God comes to most men gradually, but his impact on me was sudden and profound. So here we have it. And it made me think of his spiritual experience. Bill talks about the great wind, right? And in the American Indian, their culture, it was a lot about, you know, spirit of the wind, the rain, and the sun, and the elements, right? Because they live directly within the elements. So that's where that came from. So it's pretty amazing when the whole thing comes together like that. And again, I always refer back to this. How is this related to what our addictions, right? Everything, because we can now substitute this joy and freedom for alcohol, for drugs. That's what we're looking for with the food. And I always bring it back to that. We're looking for that happiness and joy. So when we bring these steps in and we have these feelings of these momentary pleasures, these material things, power over people, money, success, in these stories, it tells us to go back to that. And then the food is no longer a higher power. We have a better way. So let's go to page 413. That's another one that I really like. We'll get to that. Okay. And on the bottom of page 413, in the last paragraph, it says, in the hospital, I hung onto the idea that I had most of my life, that if I could just control. You know, again, it's a simple program. In the last excerpt we talked about, he wanted to control things on the outside, but he realized the inside is where the only control he needed. The external environment, the internal would become comfortable, right? So if only in the story we read last week, where that woman who kept on marrying these men to find happiness and joy, right? So the thing is, here again, we're looking for something outside of us. And he's saying that. So here's when he hit bottom in the story. And then it goes on to say on the next page, if we go to page 414, it says in the middle of the beginning part of about 5 sentences down from the top, but we have turned our will and our lives over to the care of God. Again, talking about grace, that spiritual awakening, being our partner. Each with the other as a witness, we took the third step out loud, just as it says in the big book. Okay, so they're talking here about the third step. So just go to page 63 for a minute. And again, this is the relationship and what these 12 steps are about. And the spiritual, again, the only answer is they talk about that. Dr. Silkworth talks about it, and We agnostics, and throughout the whole book, they said the only solution to our problem would be a spiritual one. So it says here, if you read the third step prayer, well, we read this many times. The paragraph before it talks about as we felt new power. This on page 63. Flow in, we enjoyed peace of mind. So this is what they're talking about, the spiritual awakening. We discover we could face life successfully. As we become conscious of his presence, we begin to lose fear of today, tomorrow, and the hereafter. So the spiritual awakening and the promises say we'll lose all this fear of economic insecurity, of people, we'll be happy, joyous, and free. Because after all, it was our defects of character that were blocking it out. And again, the solution was they will be cast out when we do steps 5, 6, and 7. They're cast out from us, right? We don't have to do anything. That's the beauty of this program. Once we confess them, we do step 4, 5. We confess them to somebody and we bring them out to the sunlight. And we realize, hey, they're not. We're hiding these secrets our whole life, but the person we're talking to might just sit there and yawn and say, well, I did the same thing a million times. So we get rid of the guilt and shame. And then we have a way where we don't even have to, after that, the only work we have to do is go to our higher consciousness or higher power, like that American Indian did, and like what we have here. So lose our fear of today, tomorrow, hereafter, we were reborn. So it goes on to say with the third step prayer, exactly what we're talking about. Again, we can go through this, and I do what we do on many times, but even if I did it a million times, it's just worth every day during the day, all day long, to believe this. First of all, God, I offer myself to thee. So that's what was done in that story. He finally realized he just offered himself to God to build with me, to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of bonds of self, that I may better do thy will, take away my difficulties. And then it goes, that victory over them may bear witness to those I help with thy power, thy love. In other words, when we talk about these sentimentalities, things that happen to us, long lost loves, and we get resentful, angry, jealousy. Here it says thy love. It's no longer coming from the ego, from Bob anymore. It's coming from this higher consciousness. The devil is coming in, and he's and the no power and the is all due. It's like a battlefield in our mind. The devil's trying to make us go back to these lower ways of thinking, of anxiety, fear, resentment. But the higher consciousness is there. Our soul is there. This way, it says we were always here in this book. Born in every man, woman, and child is the idea of this consciousness. And the way we know it is that when you get rid of your fear and your anxiety, your jealousy, your envy, these 7 deadly sins, right? That Bill talks about in the Bible, but on page 48, he lists them there. Then all of a sudden we just become happy and joyous, just like that. It's because it's in there all the time. Again, I refer to a child. Or another example I use is a puppy dog. A puppy dog, they say the best day is every day of its life. Ever see how happy they are to see you and everything in life? Well, that has to do with because they don't have that higher level of thinking that we have. We misuse it. It talks about here about self-will run riot. But anyway, so this is all related. Again, I bring it, the reason we have a 12-step program, people come in is because they're alcoholics, drug addicts, they have other issues and all of that compulsion with the food and everything. So these thoughts that we have and the negativity brings us into the addictions, because we're looking for that ease and comfort that comes with that first compulsive bite, that first drink. That's what we're looking for. But we started to realize, and the spiritual awakening was in these stories, was that when people realize that we can get something much better. Not only that, the addiction is bringing us into the self. Do you realize how that happens? Do you realize that if you're drinking alcohol or food, it's feeding the ego, because you're sitting there saying, I don't need anything, I don't need to be happy from within. I can find it in everything outside of myself. If I have that drink, that's something, that's a material thing. If I have that food, if I have more money, if I have people respect me, but it keeps on feeding the ego, and it gets worse and worse and more, and we'll get off center, and the whole life becomes, this is what our life becomes. I'm going to just talk in what happened in Bill, because Bill's story is so pertinent to this whole thing. If you go to page 8, here's what happens. This is where the anti thing with the happy, joyous, and free is, and when the ego gets involved. You tell me, when we read this, the first paragraph on page 8 in Bill's story, no words can tell of the loneliness and despair I found in the morass of self-pity. Quicksand stretched all around me in all directions. I had met my match. I've been overwhelmed. Alcohol was my master. So why was he in bitter morass and self-pity? Where did this come from? It came from his addiction. It could be any addiction to food or success or money, because he didn't have a way out. He didn't have a solution. His solution to the problem was more money, because in the beginning of his story, the whole beginning of Bill's story, he talks about he wanted to be like Walter Hagen. He was a famous golfer then. There's one point in here where he says in Bill's story, it was all about the self and the ego. He's trying to find, he says on page 2, the drive for success was on. I'd prove to the world I was important. So Bill, what? He was never going to be happy till he thought he was important. But what happened to Bill? They say pride before the fall. So he was very prideful. He was going to show the world he was in the war. He was coming out. He was going to be the hero. He was going to get involved. He was going to be the number one man. He was going to be successful. He was going to have people love and respect him. And then we wonder why. And said he wanted to be a golfer like Walter Hagen. He tried golf. He was obsessed by that. So that brought him to what? The pride before the fall, right? So he had no humility left. It was all about getting people to like him. So that's what happened on page 8. He was lonely since despair. Because look, we're going to have depression, anxiety if we feel that we have to have our expectations of that thing should be a certain way. If I feel I should be a very wealthy or successful person, and quote, the way society thinks I should be, and if I'm not, well, I'm going to be very depressed. If I think that somebody should like me and they don't, and I base my whole self respect on if they like me or not, I'm going to be depressed. So when we have the spiritual awakening, it's not about us anymore. It's about the higher consciousness. It's about the bliss and joy. Again, as I said the last time, all those other things are pleasure. Again, somebody could climb Mount Everest, right? Spend all that money, all that time, all that effort. And when they get to the top, they have that momentary pleasure. You call it pleasure. You could win the lottery. It's pleasure, right? A momentary pleasure. But on the other side too, it creates as much upset, because when the guy climbs Mount Everest, if his concern is about climbing mountains, then there's always another mountain to climb, or he's got to climb it a second time. He's got to go to all 8, there's high 8 mountains, I think, in the world. Otherwise, he's not going to be happy. When somebody wins the lottery and they win $1 million, and that was all the joy and happiness, when the neighbor they know has $2 million, or they see somebody, they get jealous and envious, because the priority in making the higher power is those material things. So again, we have a way out through this spiritual awakening. And that's what happened. Well, since we're on Bill's story, I mean, I had some other ones, but his friend Ebby came in. He said he was fresh skinned and lively, and his eyes lit up and everything was great. And he asked him what happened, and Ebby said, I got religion. So Ebby was a down and out drunk. He ended up sponsoring Bill, but the situation was where he had that spiritual awakening just when he realized that it wasn't all about him. The whole religions and philosophies is losing the self, getting out of self, and getting, because the self-centeredness is, as it says on page 62, selfishness, self-centeredness, that's the root of our problem. So it said God had done for him what he could not do for himself. His human will had failed. This is on page 11. So anytime we go to self-will, it fails every time. That's what it talks about here. Now, again, anytime I try, again, I want to relate this to the addiction with the food again. Anytime I try to do it on my own will. So if during the day I say, I'm not going to have this, I'm not going to have that. No, I bring it to a higher level. People say, that how does prayer work? Well, it works because it brings my consciousness to another level. So when a person says to me, I'm on another level, when I see all that food, when I'm going to go take that drink or drug, it's at another level where it's such a higher consciousness that I don't need that money. I don't need that pill. I don't need that drug. I don't need the alcohol. I don't need the food, and I reflect from as a hot flame, and I'm neutral, because I realize the devastation in it. I don't need it. I know how bad food is, right? But I needed it because that's where I found my source of happiness. But now with the knowledge and knowing all the diseases and the havoc and what it does to my body, physically and mentally, it's sort of, it's like I have something better now. Why would I want to go back to that? Why would I want to have alcohol in my breath, walk around and being sloppy and being inebriated with a drug too? Why would I want to walk around with resentment towards somebody? I don't need that anymore because you know, it's confidence in a higher power. I told about the story. This guy I work with, he was from India, and he said when the elephant walked down the street and the dogs barked at the elephant's feet, the elephant didn't pay attention. It was so big and had such confidence, it didn't matter. So now all of these things, these material things. So we're so miserable. Another one is success, right? And money. We're so miserable about that. And that's because we're in the human experience. We're in the five senses. You know, in the Kabbalah is a way of thinking. They have this thing called the Zohar. But the whole thing behind that philosophy is that we can go out in the material world and enjoy it. But we have to realize the lie of the world around us. Go out and enjoy it, but it's all a big lie. And the way we know is 10 people or everybody in this meeting will interpret what I say, what happens here during the meeting, as many people here different ways, right? That's the way we observe the world. It's like a filter. It comes in and we don't see it truthfully. We just see it through, and it talks about in the big book, our own plans and designs. So when we pray, meditate, and we get centered, then we don't have to react to the places, people, and things. We don't have to react to the food on that level anymore. Then we intuitively will know we don't need to be, again, the corporations, right? Again, they put all of this nonsense in the food and they just for all the money and to make you addicted to it, just like drugs or alcohol, whatever it is, or advertising success. We were brought up that way, crazy thinking. We have to realize our brain is crazy. We were brought up to think that we had to be good in sports, academically. We had to be in the in crowd when we grew up. We had to have people like us. That's all crazy thinking. That doesn't come, that's self-will. That's the self. When we have this spiritual awakening and God consciousness, it's just the joy is in there already. We don't, and when I read about God's grace, that is something God has given us, created in his image. It's there all the time. But again, he also, what he did great for us, he gave us this intellect where we could think of the past, the future. But as it says, self-will run riot. We misuse every good thing people in life can misuse. I mean, it could be some weapons and stuff that man made, and they can misuse them, right, for evil. So what we do, believe it or not, the devil, that's the evil side of us. The dark side is it could be called anything like that. We use that to rule us, right? So we can become, it's a battlefield. So we can become, overcome that through praying to God, meditating, bringing God in throughout the day, doing these steps, having had that spiritual awakening. Step 12 talks about that. Then we have that perception change, like with the food, right? Here we go again. This is the perception change here. And I told the story about the smoothie now. I don't have to make it so delicious with all the sweeteners in it. I want to taste I put like some berries and stuff in, but I want to taste God's gift of the greens. Now I taste the greens, believe it or not. I put in like say kale and spinach and things like that. And I just love that taste. Another thing too is that this change with the palate physiologically, sometimes and psychologically, could take sometimes 2 or 3 weeks. I never mentioned that before, but we have to give ourselves time, that detox period, first of all. But if you like praise God for the water, if you praise God for the greens, which are the most healthiest foods, and again, the problem with the food from all the corporations is what? In the supermarket, there's like 25, 50 ingredients in there, and they're also very high caloric. They put in the salt, the oil, and the sugar. The saturated fat, the oil, the sugar. They use synthetics, oils, sugars, and sweeteners, and that's not from God. That's not God consciousness. That's not being neutrality, what we have in the 10-step promises, being neutral. It tells the 10-step promises what it says there. It says, let me read that quickly, just a few sentences from it. We are not fighting it. Again, we can't, these diets don't work. Again, I was the other night watching that 600-pounder meeting where they have the stomach surgery. And I always say on the meeting, they say right before that 95% of this doesn't work. And sure enough, it said it there. They're saying that right on their show. So you can imagine. I can't believe they say that, but they do. They want to be honest about it. But 95% of the time, it doesn't work with relationships with people, with living my life. When I take the self-will back, and if I don't have that change transformation, the transformation talks about in this book, in you know on page 25 and 26, and oddly enough, why they call the paragraph there as a solution, right? It talks about that transformation. So, well, let me just finish the 10-step promises. Safe and protected, we have not even sworn off. Instead, the problem has been removed. So wouldn't it be beautiful if the problem is removed, where you don't have to think of these lattes and these drinks with all these calories? This alone, I'm telling you right now, when you think of with soda and stuff like that, how many calories a day, a week, a year you drink? If you have that transformation with this alone, it's going to be life changing, and your weight will take care of itself. But that's the only answer. In doctor's opinion, and we agnostics, it says on page 44, what does it say there? It says, in the bottom of the first paragraph on page 44, we are suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. And that's why I read to you these spiritual experiences that these people had. And then it goes on to say in the next paragraph towards the end, to be doomed to an alcoholic or compulsive overeating or whatever else death you want, or to live on a spiritual basis are not always easy alternatives to face. So it comes down to this, because a lot of people say, and they listen to this and they say, again, how are the steps that spiritual awakening? How can I relate it to the food? It just does. It does, and it talks about in this book, in many places, it says the answer to all our problems. It could be money, success, fear of people, economic insecurity. It could be the alcohol, food, drugs, whatever it is, because those are all, again, coming from the self. They're coming from the ego. The ego wants to be fed. So when you're eating, think about you're feeding the ego. You're not feeding the real you. You're eating to live, not, so like that's what goes on with us. So okay, anyway, we're getting there. So anyway, that's it. It was a spiritual awakening, and through these stories, and when I read them this morning, even before the meeting to review them, it was like every day we have that opportunity to be in fit spiritual condition. So by reading this and reading one of these, like when I have a problem, I just go to one of these things, and when it tells me here, it's not about you, Bob. That's not the truth. The truth is all these things you imagine in your mind, the resentment, the fear, the anger, all of these things aren't true. The truth is, it doesn't matter what other people think. It doesn't matter if I have money or not. The thing is, the truth isn't in the food, in our addictions. It's in the happy, because we're looking for the pleasure and we're looking for the joy and happiness. But that's outside of us. Anything outside, it's not working, because it fails by its very nature. But because the real joy and happiness is from within. So anyway, with that, I'll leave it up to everybody else. I know I love